Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I'm a librarian at the Ramsey County Libraries, and I um, schedule historical and current event programming. And today, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on Barbie, the movie, the doll, the phenomenon. And our presenter today is Laurie Ouelette. She is jointly appointed as a professor of communication studies and cultural studies and comparative literature at the University of Minnesota. She works across pardon my stumbling over my words today, the interdisciplinary fields of critical media and cultural studies, with a focus on media and popular culture's role in shaping, governing, and regulating bodies, subjectivities, and differences such as gender, sexuality, race, ability, and class. Her current research projects focus on precarity, media, and women and true crime. She's written such books as Lifestyle TV, which draws from social and political theory to situate television as a cultural technology of citizenship, lifestyle, labor, and self-making. She's also edited co-edited Keywords in Media Study with Jonathan Gray. She's the co-author of Better Living Through Reality TV, Television and Post-Welfare People, and co-editor of Reality TV, Remaking Television Culture. Her research has appeared in a number of journals, such as European Journal of Cultural Studies, Cultural Studies, Television and New Media, Cinema Journal, Continuum, which is Journal of Media and Cultural Studies, Media, and in edited collections and anthologies. She is editor-in-chief of Television and New Media and a columnist for Film Quarterly. She has a PhD in communications from the University of Massachusetts and a Master of Arts in Media Studies from the New School of Social Research. Okay, now without any further ado, handing things over to Laurie. Hi, Laurie.
Hi, Kay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the webinar. I'm really excited to be here. I taught this course called Barbie, the movie, the doll, and the phenomenon last year at the University of Minnesota for the Cultural Studies Department. And as Kay mentioned, I'm a professor of popular culture and media studies, which means that I'm interested in the history and the meanings and the power dynamics of movies, TV, toys, celebrities, and icons like Barbie. So in this course, we took the blockbuster Barbie movie as a jumping off point for thinking about the endurance and the resonance of Barbie as a cultural icon. I'm sure many of you know that Barbie is not new. Barbie emerged in 1959, although my 18-year-old students did not know that, which means that she's actually 66 years old. And while Barbie has not aged, which is something we might want to talk about later on, she has evolved and adapted in dialogue with changes in society, particularly in dialogue with the way that we understand femininity, feminism, and female empowerment. So, one of the aims of my course was to situate the Barbie movie as the latest chapter of a longer story. So, what I thought would be interesting to do today is to kind of periodize Barbie and her evolving relationship to gender as a framework for thinking about our own Barbie stories. And most of us have our own Barbie stories. But before that, I thought I'd say a little bit more about what I do as a scholar and how I approach things like Barbie. Um, you may be surprised to learn that the university has a course on Barbie, and you would not be alone. Some of the parents of my students were also surprised, could not imagine what we would be doing in such a course. Um, but I would argue that precisely because Barbie is so popular and so resonant, that it's absolutely the kind of course that we need to be having. So I work in the field of cultural studies, which is a relative latecomer to the university scene. And in a nutshell, what we do is look at how popular culture is made, the meanings and the values that it circulates, and how it shapes our identities and our understandings of the world. So, some of my colleagues look at more esteemed forms of culture like novels or poems, but my work actually applies the same kinds of close reading techniques to the cultural texts and artifacts that are so present in our everyday worlds. But unlike conventional literary criticism, cultural studies also looks outward to the broader context of culture, to think about the capitalist industries that make mass culture, to think about the ways that ordinary people engage with popular culture and media, and to think about some of the oppositional and maybe unintended uses and consequences of the culture that is produced within these commercial mass cultural frameworks. And then finally, to get a handle on the forms of culture that resonate broadly. Why did Barbie become so popular? Why did the movie become a blockbuster? Um, Cultural studies looks at socio-historical context, and this is where my research is really focused. I'm interested in how popular culture shapes is shaped by the ideologies, anxieties, hopes, aspirations, and struggles of particular eras. So, what brings all of this together is a focus on cultural politics. Cultural studies grew out of the social and political movements of the 1960s and 70s, and it's especially interested in the mediation of power and authority, and including gender, race, class, and other differences and hierarchies. So, come back to the question of a course on Barbie, because we live in a world saturated by mass culture, I always tell my students that these issues are worthy not only of academic study, but of the kinds of public conversations that we're having today. So, just to think about the Barbie movie, which I'm sure many of you saw, which was a blockbuster in the summer of 2023. If we were to take the cultural studies model and think about, the meanings of Barbie, but also to zoom out and think about the broader context of production and reception and history, we could think about that in really interesting ways. Um, a lot of the buzz around Barbie focused on, its relationship to feminism, but it's also important to think about Barbie as a product of mass culture. So this was a huge success, the highest grossing film of 2023, the biggest debut for a female director, which is important. But it was also, in many ways, a giant commercial for Mattel, which is the company that manufactures Barbie. So at the time of the movie, Barbie sales were lagging, and the movie really catapulted Barbie back into the spotlight and generated a boost in sales and all kinds of consumer product revenue as well. So, if you look at all the product placements and the tie-ins and the partnerships and the endless promotion around Barbie, it's easy to say that this is just a giant commercial, end of story. But from a cultural studies perspective, that would be to stop short of really thinking about the resonance of this particular film at a certain moment in time. So to look at the deeper of meaning of Barbie would be, to think about the way that it taps into and expresses conversations and frustrations around gender and feminism. So the idea that Barbie, is a film about a doll, is one side of the story, but it's also a film about the place of women in the real world too. So if you saw the film, you know what I'm talking about here. Barbie Land, where all the Barbies live, is female-centered, and in this way, it kind of evokes the girl play of pre-adolescent girls. And all of the positions of power are held by women. It's kind of this utopia. But then there's a problem, and traditional Barbie has to journey to the real world to figure it out. So the problem is triggered by her discovery that her arched feet have gone flat. So she goes to the real world and she encounters sexism and a loss of self-esteem, comes back to Barbie Land. There's a struggle over patriarchy. The Kens want to be in charge. And eventually, the Barbies kind of reclaim this utopia, but not without learning lessons about the contradictions and the impossibilities of femininity in society. So there's a kind of lesson that is learned. And the movie is also incredibly steeped in Barbie nostalgia and Mattel history, which I'll say a little bit more about as we go on. So because Barbie was very much about gender struggles, it's not surprising that its reception was controversial. So lots of us loved the Barbie movie, generated all kinds of sales, but it also triggered a debate and even a backlash against the feminism that some perceived in the film. So while women were turning out in droves in their, pink clothing and really embracing this movie, there was also, kind of political backlash where certain public figures were arguing that the movie was man-hating and it was problematic. And a conservative influencer, Ben Shapiro, got a lot of attention for actually lighting Barbie and Ken on fire in protest to the film. But the question, is Barbie a feminist icon, which triggered this reaction and which really dominated the extensive media coverage of the film, is something that I think needs to be placed in a broader socio-historical context. And that's what I wanted to do with the course, is to think about, this question is very difficult to answer without looking at a broader a series of shifts in the way that society navigates questions around gender and femininity. So to look at the socio-historical context can help us to understand what are the stakes of this question, right? What does it mean to think about Barbie as a feminist icon? And how has Barbie adapted and evolved, while also remaining very much the same to the point where we are having these kinds of conversations? So in my course, there's actually a remarkable amount of Barbie scholarship, and we read a lot of it. These were two books that I recommend that we read that are really helpful for tracing this socio-historical context. And the presentation I'm giving today draws from some insights from these books. Forever Barbie, the unauthorized biography of a real doll by M.G. Lord, and the Barbie Chronicles, which is a little bit of an older book, but still really, really helpful, which is an edited collection. So to put Barbie and the most recent chapter of Barbie's relationship to femininity and feminism within a historical context, it's helpful to think about when Barbie first emerged. So Barbie emerges in 1959. So this is before the women's movement of the 1970s. So she emerges in a pre-feminist context. These are photos of the original Barbie. Let me see if I can move this so you can see it. And the doll was created by a woman named Ruth Handler, who has a cameo in the Barbie movie. And she went on to co-found a company called Mattel, which continues to manufacture Barbie and other toys. And the doll was inspired, some would say, virtually copied from a German adult novelty doll. This novelty doll was risque and very sexual. And Handler thought that, she could adapt this as a toy for children. And so Barbie was introduced and marketed as an alternative to baby dolls, which were really the only dolls that girls were given to play with during this period or any period up to the introduction of Barbie. And in her earliest incarnation, Barbie was marketed as a teenage fashion model, although if you look at Barbie, she looks very much like an adult. So this is a scene from the Barbie movie that really highlights the importance of introducing a different kind of doll for girls to play with, right? Disrupting the idea that little girls aspire to be mothers and homemakers. And this is really short, so I'm going to see if I can get this to play.
Since the beginning of time, since the first little girl ever existed, there have been dolls. But the dolls were always and forever baby dolls. Until...
So that is an example of how much the Barbie movie is steeped in kind of Mattel's own history. Fascinating. So when Barbie first emerges, she's modeled after this risque adult German doll, but she's also intersecting with the context of Hollywood during the post-war era. So there's a historian named Stephanie Kuntz who's written a number of really fascinating books about the history of women during the post-war era. And she talks about in an essay on Barbie called Golden Oldie how Barbie's resonance and the fact that she became so successful and really took off, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was part of the classic Hollywood era and the real life sex goddesses of the time, people like Marilyn Monroe, whose measurements were, not so different from Barbie's exaggerated female form. And she argues that while this was definitely an alternative to baby dolls and to housewifery as an aspiration, that it was really also an extension of conventional gender roles and marital roles and consumerist values of the period in that, these icons were really not separate from, the idea of, marriage and aspiration to marriage. They just kind of embodied a period between girlhood and marriage. Koons also talks about how, while this was the pre-feminist era, there was a lot of discontent that was brewing around, women's expected role as mothers and wives. And Betty Friedan, would soon coin the problem that had no name in her book on women's plight during this period. And it was in this context that, mothers in some ways embraced the idea that maybe their daughters could aspire to be something else than a mother. But mothers were also concerned that Barbie was too sexual and mature, If you look at Barbie, she has very large breasts. She's got a lot of makeup on. She's got that hourglass figure, wearing that swimsuit. And so there was a little bit of concern about this doll, and Mattel addressed that by hiring a high-powered market research company to think about how could we appeal to the mom so that they'll buy their daughters these toys. And what they ended up doing is arguing that Barbie would make a little lady out of young girls, that, dressing Barbie and attending to Barbie's femininity would be useful to mothers as a way to teach them how to be proper little women. And so Barbie's play was associated with learning and doing femininity. And Mattel also softened Barbie's features and removed some of the extreme makeup, gave her a bit more of an innocent look, and then launched all of these clothing and accessory lines to enable this, sense of learning and doing femininity, and also, of course, to bolster Mattel's profits. So the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir was thinking about the socialization of women during this period, and she famously argued that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So we can think about Barbie and her relationship to gender, femininity, and the idea of doing femininity as a project of socialization. We can think about, what impact this had on girls in terms of teaching them what does it mean to be female, right? What should you aspire to be? What's important? How should we look, right? How should we be in this world? So this is the first Barbie commercial where I think you can really see this idea of doing femininity on display, and we can really see Mattel's promotion of Barbie as a tool of female socialization.
Barbie, you're beautiful. You make me feel my Barbie doll is really real. Barbie's small and so petite. Her clothes and figure look so neat. Her dancing outfit rings the bell. At parties she will cast a spell. Purses, hats, and gloves galore. And all the gadgets gals adore.
Barbie dressed for swim and fun is only $3. Her lovely fashions range from $1 to $5. Look for Barbie wherever dolls are sold.
Someday I'm gonna be exactly like you. Till then I know just what I'll do. Barbie, beautiful Barbie, I'll make believe that I am you.
You can tell it's Mattel. It's swell.
I love the clothes in the commercial. It's such great vintage fashion. So I agree with Stephanie Coontz that and others that Barbie was very much a tool of female socialization. But I also agree with scholars who point out that, Barbie was also kind of radical in that she lived alone, she was independent, she never married. She eventually got a boyfriend, Ken, but he was sidelined. So Barbie lived in this, world of young female adulthood where she kind of was a prototype for Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl. And I think that, allowing girls to stop playing at being mothers was really significant. So this is Barbie's first dream house from 1962. And you can see in the dream house that there's no kitchen, right? There literally isn't a kitchen in this house. And, for Barbie to have her own home, it's important to remember that women were often refused mortgages without male co-signers during this period. And if we look at, the decor, we see books, we see college pendants, we see an idea that Barbie is, college educated. She is independent. She is taking care of herself. So second wave feminism really had some problems with Barbie. Um, and the discontent around Barbie had to do with discontent around the roles that women were assigned, and particularly the idea that women's first and most important duty in life was to be pretty, was to be attractive, was to be on display for men. And so there were protests and concerns organized by the National Organization for Women and other groups that really took issue with this body type of Barbies, the 18-inch waist, the 39-inch bust, right, the arched feet, and also really called out Barbie's limited career options. The 1965 Slumber Party Barbie came with a scale that was permanently set to 110 pounds and had a diet book telling her literally not to eat, how to lose weight, don't eat. So this was a concern. And because Barbie was kind of an icon of femininity, Barbie became a symbol of feminist protest as well. And I love this Marge Piercy poem. I won't have time to read it to you today, but we did discuss it extensively in my course in 1971, right? This is a poem called Barbie Doll, and it really talks about the judgments and the expectations that women face in terms of how they look, right? But it also talks about cutting off the nose and the legs of the Barbie and the forms of resistance to these gendered ideals and expectations. And what's interesting in the research on Barbie is that historically, lots and lots of girls and some men too have mutilated their Barbies and have, disassembled them and altered them and done all kinds of things with them that really contradict some of the ideals that Barbie embodies. I know I remember dyeing my Barbie's hair with food coloring and doing all kinds of things with it. And so this is a reminder that even if Barbie represents one set of meanings, that she can also be used to challenge those meanings. So in the 1970s, Mattel does respond to the women's movement in some respect, really in a really minor ways. Barbie's given a makeover. She gets long, straight hair, a tan, a posable body. You can see she looks less like a caricature. And there's a little nod to the counterculture and this collector's Barbie. Um, and in 1980, finally, we get the first Black Barbie. Previously, the only Black Barbies were sidekicks. And so we get the first Black Barbie. And if you're interested in that story, I highly recommend this documentary, Black Barbie. I think it's on Hulu. So Mattel is, making some adjustments and kind of taking in the way that society is changing and thinking about tweaking Barbie accordingly. And of course, the reason for that is that, in order to remain marketable, Barbie needs to adapt. Barbie's also given a new house. She gets this townhouse in 1974 that is, very urban. It's filled with books and plants. And this was actually my Barbie dream house. So I remember very fondly playing with this elevator and, almost imagining what it would be like to be, an independent adult woman living in my own, townhouse in a city somewhere. So these changes were, in some ways superficial, but also resonant. And then in the 1980s, we see Barbie responding to, in a very kind of belated way, responding to the demands of the women's movement, but in a really curious way that doesn't seem to acknowledge feminism. So suddenly Barbie can be anything. She's having careers in her pink power suits, right? But this is more a form of post-feminism than an engagement with second wave feminism itself. And the reason I say that is that post-feminism refers to changes in the culture that reflect this assumption that women have made progress because of feminism. But precisely because of that progress, it also conveys the idea that feminism is therefore irrelevant and maybe even undesirable. Like, we did that, now we're all equal and free. So Barbie kind of bypasses feminism, but starting in the 80s, she is very much a product of these post-feminist ideas. This is 1985 Day to Night Barbie, which broke the glass ceiling as a CEO. But look how she's dressed. Look at the pink, right? So she's still very much ensconced in, ideas about femininity. Barbie's getting something of a makeover here. She can go from day to night, right? She can be anything. And that was, in fact, the name of this revamp of Barbie. Barbie, you can be anything. Baby doctor, right? We girls can do anything. And so, this is significant too, in really important ways. But what it doesn't account for are all of the structural inequalities that prevent women, particularly women of color and lower income women, of actually having access to the resources to be anything. By the 90s, Barbie apparently was making a lot of money as a CEO because she got a new dream house, which is a kind of a McMansion. So we can see here that Barbie's lifestyle is also changing. So Mattel continues to diversify Barbie in the 80s. The first Latina Barbie is introduced in 1988. There was the Barbie Dolls of the World line that debuts in 1980. But these efforts have been criticized for exoticizing racial and ethnic differences and also for placing traditional Barbie, who is assumed to be white, at the kind of center of the Barbie universe. So these Barbies were difficult to find, often collector's items, right? They weren't the ones featured in the commercials, they were sidelined. Today, Mattel claims to have the most diverse doll line in the world, and it is true that they have added a broader range of body types and different kinds of people to the Barbie family. But in my class, when we looked into this, we discovered that most of these diverse Barbies, again, are really hard to find. You have to go online and buy them at the website. They're not the dolls you see in Target. They're not the ones in the commercials. So even though Mattel has definitely made progress and opened up, the idea of who can be Barbie, it's still very much, that model of centering the white traditional Barbie, as was the case in the Barbie movie. So what can't Barbie be? I mean, one of the things we did in the course is to really think about this. And the students, remade Barbie dolls, using all kinds of craft materials and really thought about, who can't Barbie be and tried to make those versions of Barbie. And some of the things we came up with that Barbie can't be is unfeminine, old, poor, depressed, queer, non-binary, anti-materialist, or activist. So in the 90s, we see what some scholars call a form of third wave feminism emerging among young women who are really interested in popular culture, right? And they love popular culture, and they're very playful in their activism and interested in a kind of culture jamming where you take the products of mass culture and kind of tweak them in a playful way that's also about social criticism. So when Teen Talk Barbie was introduced in 1992, and her phrases were incredibly sexist, like math class is tough, the Barbie Liberation Organization decided to switch out the doll's voice box with G.I. Joe, talking G.I. Joe, saying all kinds of, active things and did that in stores so that people were buying these switched dolls. They got a lot of news attention, really calling out the stereotypical assumptions that were still attached to Barbie. There's a whole episode of The Simpsons where this incident is parodied as well. More recently, in the 2000s, Mattel has attempted to address the incredibly unrealistic body that Barbie's had for so many decades. One study found that, women really couldn't even walk with Barbie's body and with her original body and with her arched feet. And Mattel came up with some alternative types. So there was a curvy Barbie, a tall Barbie, a petite Barbie, and this generated a lot of attention about, what this means that Barbie can now have body confidence and can reflect the bodies that real women actually have. And I think this was a great development. Unfortunately, um, it it had its limitations. And one of those limitations is that it tied in with this larger phenomenon of corporations using the veneer of body positivity to sell us products and, encourage us to think about our self-esteem and empower ourselves over social change, right? What do women need to do together to challenge these standards? The Dove Corporation is a company that uses body positivity in this way. If you're interested in this story of Barbie's remaking to have these different body types, I highly recommend the documentary Tiny Shoulders, Rethinking Barbie. And I think this is also on Hulu. So these are accessible documentaries. In my class, we got interested in these different body types. And again, we did a little research and we found that we couldn't even find these dolls anymore, right? That, they're so marginalized and on the sidelines that if you go into a Target or a Walmart, right, that these are not the dolls that you're going to see. You're going to see the traditional Barbie doll. Anyway, one thing that has happened is that a larger percent of Barbie dolls are given flat feet, and that was the dilemma of the Barbie movie. So as of 2020, only 40% of dolls had the extreme heel arch of the original Barbie. And that often corresponds with the Barbies who are sold as having careers or some kind of a hobby, maybe dog walker Barbie, for example. So where we are today is, back to the idea of the Barbie movie. So here we have this blockbuster film, and it is, takes over popular culture for the summer of 2023. It is discussed endlessly. It's TikToked, there are commentators, news panels. Everybody's talking about Barbie and feminism and gender and femininity. And I think that one of the useful frameworks for thinking about the success of the Barbie movie is the concept of popular feminism, which comes from an author named Sarah Banet Weiser, who wrote a book called Empowered. And she argues that we live in a moment now that's different from post-feminism, right? That feminism has oddly become mainstreamed, but it's also become commodified, right? Everywhere you turn, you can see positive references to feminism, both on the part of corporations and also celebrities and in television and film, including the Barbie movie. And this makes feminism accessible to large audiences, right? When we see the Barbie movie, it's also a movie about what is feminism, right? And Benet Weiser argues that this can trigger a kind of reactive misogyny, the kind that we saw with Ben Shapiro burning the Barbie dolls and political commentators on Fox News talking about, how terrible this movie is and how biased it is against men. But I think that, well, I agree that the Barbie movie is, it kind of resonates within this moment of popular feminism. I think that it also really articulates the contradictions of femininity, right? The contradictions that existed in 1959, and that despite all of the changes, all of the movements for social change, all of the gains that we have seen, I think that we are still living with these contradictions. And I know my 18-year-old students are still living with these contradictions. So just in wrapping up, I want to replay the very famous monologue that America Ferrara gives when traditional Barbie is, kind of worn down by the real world, right? Her self-esteem has plummeted. She's confused. She thinks she's a failure. And this speech, again, it became a meme. It was kind of thought of as aspirational, was recirculated. And just as a way of wrapping up and getting to our questions, I thought I would just briefly replay this for us.
It is literally impossible to be a woman. You are so beautiful and so smart, and it kills me that you don't think you're good enough. Like, we have to always be extraordinary. But somehow we're always doing it wrong. Like, you have to be thin, but not too thin. And you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but also you have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's crass. You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the damn time. You have to be a career woman, but also always be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much or that you threaten other women, because you're supposed to be a part of the sisterhood, but always stand out and always be grateful. But never forget that the system is rigged, so find a way to acknowledge that, but also always be grateful. You have to never get old. Never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard, it's too contradictory, and nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. And it turns out, in fact, that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault. I'm just so tired of watching myself and every single other woman tie herself into knots so that people will like us. And if all of that is also true for a doll, just representing a woman, Then I don't even know.
So the Barbie movie, as popular feminism, has become iconic, and Barbie now circulates in a popular culture that associates Barbie with feminism, right? These are things that you can buy online that kind of encapsulate and mainstream the idea of feminism. But I think that Barbie is really more useful for thinking about an expression of the contradictions of femininity, rather than turning to Barbie as our model of feminism. I think we need to look to the real world and the real women who are doing the work. But I think that the film really did a great job in tapping into and taking stock of where we are now in terms of the socialization of femininity, the anxieties, the pressures, the frustrations, and so forth. In many ways, it's a kind of a feminist fantasy. But yeah, I think that I will stop there, and I am really looking forward to your questions and our conversation.
Okay. Okay, there. I was like going, I know I thought I clicked on my video. So our first question that we have, and keep them coming, people. We've got plenty of time to discuss, and there's lots of things to discuss. Is it possible that the largest share of the judgments and expectations placed on women might actually come from other women, with perhaps a smaller portion from men? Has there been some valid research on this topic?
Yeah, that's such a good question. There's a book that I love and I always teach it. It's called Ways of Seeing. It's from 1972 and it's by an art historian named John Berger. He also did a TV series and he traced the whole history of representations of the female body from, um, oil paintings up through advertising. And he found that women were often presented as if they were being looked at by a man. And he argued that these sorts of conventions really point to a contradiction, which is that women end up internalizing expectations, and they kind of adopt that way of seeing. They internalize it so that we come to see ourselves the way others see us, and that because of the conventions of seeing women in that way, then being beautiful becomes a competition, right? And so when we internalize and we're always judging ourselves, and I think that's true. I think we are our own worst critics. I think that much of the gendered expectations are things that women kind of impose and regulate on themselves, but it doesn't come out of nowhere, right? So that would be my answer to that, is that yes, we do internalize, and yes, we do judge others within this kind of competitive framework where there's an assumed hierarchy of who's the best, right? The most beautiful, the most feminine.
Okay. So our next question, someone was wondering about the movie. Do you think that part of the intent of the movie is to replace men rather than working with them? And
Yeah, so that was kind of that's so interesting. So Greta Gerwig, who's the director, she was very open about saying this is a feminist film, right? And Margot Robbie, who portrayed Barbie in the film, was also very open about saying this is a feminist film. Mattel did not get on board with that, right? So Mattel was not interested in a feminist film, and that to me is really interesting because so many people perceived it as about female empowerment. But to go back to a point that I made earlier, the Barbie land it's a female society, right? One could see it as a metaphor for a kind of radical feminism without men, but you could also see it as a manifestation of the of girlhood, right? Where girls are playing together in this world and they're not concerned about romance, they're not concerned about, you know, their future roles, but it's a different kind of a world. And I think for me, that is a very kind of sweet representation of the world that girls live in before they internalize the expectations of adulthood. So there's lots of research that shows that self-esteem for girls really plummets once they reach about 13. And this is a pre-adolescent world, right? And then you know, yes, it's very much a binary, right? They're more interested, I think, in retaining their power and, you know, restoring Barbie land to this, you know, this world that is ruled by women. But I think it's in some ways it's a kind of fantasy. That's what makes it really fun, and there's a lot of humor in that too. Um, so yes, I think they are interested in retaining their power, getting that, you know, female world back rather than working with the Kens. But I think that that's what makes the film so charming in some ways and so much of a fantasy more than actual commentary.
So, do you think that women versus men in companies start, not quite sure about how they're phrasing this, start using sex in companies to increase sales? Do you think, if I'm thinking that this is a depiction of women versus men in marketing more so than actually in companies. But okay, whoever wrote that one, clarify specifically what you mean by that. And we're going to move on to the next one. So that was anonymous attendee. Can clarify that one. And I'm going to move on to our next one because I want a little more clarification on that. So what do we do about the backlash we're currently living under and the erosion of women's rights and autonomy in terms of, do you think that this speaks to this in any way?
Yeah. Well, these are such interesting questions. I was expecting people to want to talk about Barbie.
Which we probably will still, but
I would love for people to share their Barbie stories that we could talk about too. So yes, I mean, at the end of the Barbie movie, when, you know, Barbie becomes a real woman, she goes to a gynecologist, right? And that's the ending of the film. And it's ironic that, you know, the women's right to reproductive health is under assault, right? And what do we do about the backlash? I mean, that I don't know that Barbie is going to do anything about the backlash, right? Barbie is, but you know, Barbie is part of a society where, um, you know, where politics are dynamic and where, you know, there are always struggles and contestations, right? And Barbie has historically navigated that line without necessarily making any kind of a radical statement, right? But at the same time, Barbie has provided respite for people, creativity, right? Forms of play and pleasure, and maybe a cultural framework for thinking about and working out, you know, for themselves what feminism is, for better or worse, right? But Barbie is not going to address what's going on now. That's definitely not going to happen.
so okay. Um, Deborah writes that she liked the mother-daughter dynamic change in relationship in the movie. it made her feel as if women, we speak up, our children are listening. Comments on that she'd like.
Yeah, I liked that dynamic too. I liked that, the tension between the mom and the teenage daughter, and the mom is the one who is the Barbie fan, right? And the mom wants to keep Barbie alive, and the teenager has little regard for Barbie. There's another great monologue where Barbie goes to the real world and she encounters this teenager, and teenager tells her everything that she, is that's wrong and that is anti-feminist and demeaning and puts women down and keeps them in their place. And so they have really different viewpoints, and but it is sweet how they kind of band together, and um, they do end up being part of this sisterhood together with these Barbies. So again, it's sweet. It's a fantasy. It's kind of a feminist fantasy in that way.
So do you think Barbie reflects over time um, Title IX and women's sports?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely Barbies that are introduced who are athletic, right? But I would say, and especially there's a whole world of limited edition Barbies and collectors Barbies that are modeled after famous people, including famous athletes, right? So there will be, Barbie dolls made in the image of, of athletes, and there will be Barbies that are marketed as, tennis players or um, uh, runners, for example. But I think that with Barbie, careers and hobbies and accomplishments are often more of an accessory than the main event. So Barbie has, lots and lots of accessories, but at Barbie's core, I would say that um, it's still, um, there's still kind of a lot of similarity between these dolls in terms of their emphasis on femininity.
Okay, so I have one whose name is Barbara, and she's certain that um, be other Barbaras in the group of her 80-year-old contemporaries. But she goes, do you think that after the Barbie doll came out that um, children named Barb or Barbies decreased? That seems to be her theory anyways, that it went out of popularity as a name for children, maybe because of the Barbie doll, is what I'm gathering from this.
Um, well, Barbara is an old-fashioned name, right? And old-fashioned names go out of fashion and then sometimes they come back and they become trendy again. Um, Yeah, I don't know if it would have been because of Barbie, because I think Barbie as an icon, as a female icon, has had a lot of admirers, right? But I do know that being called a Barbie is perceived by many as a kind of insult. I had a student in my class who we talked about this, like being called a Barbie is, it's steeped in stereotypes about dumb blondes and about, bimbos and, people who aren't very bright. And so it could be that, um, because Barbie became so iconic and carried positive associations, but also some negative ones, that the name, maybe became a shorthand way of thinking about all of those things. And maybe some parents wanted to avoid that. I could see that.
So, okay, so anonymous attendee came back and they're saying, they're wondering who makes the company decisions to use sex in marketing, women or men? And that's kind of tying in with the men versus women in companies. marketing sex sells. But is what I always remember hearing that's sex sells. But um, in terms of Barbie, that's an interesting thing because you talked about the backlash from mothers at the beginning, and um, but yeah, it depends on then who's making those decisions. And I would say back at that time, it would have been a lot of men, even though.
Well, let's not forget that Barbie was invented by a woman. Right. Ruth Handel is the creative genius behind Barbie, right? And she had the idea of, taking this, adult, sexy German doll and making it into a toy for children, right? And in doing that, she invited girls to think about their sexuality, right? And to think about their adulthood in ways that were very different from the functionalist focus on, changing diapers and wheeling around a doll and a buggy and playing with toy kitchens, right? I don't think that's a bad thing, right? I think that that opens up the world, and it allows girls to think of themselves maybe as sexual subjects in some ways. And, the idea of Barbie living alone and being independent and having this whole, world for herself. I think that that undoubtedly inspired a lot of little girls to think about their futures in different ways, right? To think about, who do I want to be, right? What is my path in life, right? And so I think that it's much more complicated than sex sells. That's a really limited understanding of what's going
Mhm.
on with Barbie, right? And Barbie's never allowed to be fully sexual, right? Barbie is, if you look at the vast universe of Barbie, the magazines, there are lots of other Barbie movies, right? Barbie can date, but she's not so interested in dating. Barbie is mostly interested in Barbie's world and the other female Barbies and her townhouse or her, McMansion. And so Barbie's not really about, Barbie isn't really about dating, right? It's about exploring what it means to be feminine and that kind of doing femininity.
Okay, in what ways do you think the centrality of Barbie in the US influenced the development of feminism here as compared to other countries?
Yeah, that is such a good question. One of the things I didn't talk about is that Barbie is a global phenomenon. So, Barbie was introduced in the United States, but Barbie circulates all over the world, right? And is played with by little girls everywhere. And the Barbie movie was also a blockbuster, places from China to Mexico. So in a way, Barbie is a global icon, right? Um, but how did it influence? I think it very much intersected with this moment in the 60s that led up to the women's movement of the 1970s, and particular versions of that movement. So, um, the idea of women being frustrated after World War II, and having to, go back into the home after having worked in the factories during the war and having had some autonomy and independence, and the promotion of, suburbia and the consumer culture of the 50s and 60s and Leave It to Beaver. And there was a lot of frustration percolating. And I think that this adult Barbie, who, really was a way to recognize that, right? And so it very much was pre-feminist in the sense that it offered an alternative to the dominant representation of idealized femininity without really challenging it, right? Without really radically overhauling it. And so I think that it was pre-feminist rather than feminist. And then, of course, feminism has many different versions. Everybody has their own view of feminism. So, there were some strands of feminism who were arguing for equal representation in the public sphere and the world of work. And there were other feminists who were interested in creating matriarchal societies, right? There were different strands of feminism. There were, feminists who were interested in questions of race and of class, right? And Barbie was, Barbie was never part of those movements, but she did articulate a kind of pre-feminist discontent with the normalized models of, femininity from the 50s.
Would you say, has Barbie ever led popular culture as opposed to just reflecting it?
Has Barbie ever led popular culture? Um, I think that it's a dynamic. I think that Barbie, um, I think that popular culture, it works in relation to society in a double way, and that it it kind of takes shape within the currents that are circulating in society, but it also contributes to them. So I think that the introduction of Barbie wasn't merely a reflection, but it was also it also shaped the way that um, aspirations for girls might be understood. And if you think about the Barbie movie, I think that the Barbie movie kind of reflects a certain idea of popular feminism, but it also shaped our conversations, right? And it
Mm.
triggered a conversation, a public conversation about where are women at, right? What is patriarchy, right? Who should be in charge? What does it mean to be a woman? And I think that that's the kind of dynamic that I see. If you think about that chart that I put up at the beginning with all the different arrows, I think that it's interesting to kind of think about it as a two-way street.
Okay. What do you think of some of the other dolls that were created in the Barbie line? Amy says, I recall playing with Skipper and Scooter, and I recall I had a Skipper. I know that. So, which was her little sister, one of them. So,
Yeah. I love the other dolls. The other dolls, um, like the little sisters and the Barbie movie is really great at bringing back some of those dolls, like the Allen doll, who was only briefly around, or Midge, right?
mm,
Um, I think that those dolls had they were in some ways about providing a surrogate family for Barbie, right? So Barbie had things to do with other people. But I think that often those dolls were, um, you know, like the best friend or the sidekick. They never outshined Barbie in
mhm.
terms of what Barbie idealized, right? And which is probably why they had more freedom to be anything you wanted them to be, right? Because they weren't Barbie, right? Because Barbie, when you've got Barbie, you're working with an existing set of conventions and an existing set of meanings, whereas um, the other dolls, and a lot of them were more androgynous, right? And it- pre-adult, right, didn't have the fully formed breasts, and really probably opened up a lot of possibilities for play that weren't necessarily about doing femininity.
Okay. So why do you think Barbie has stayed popular? This person says, I had a Barbie with extra clothes sewn by my mother. That was always a thing. And my daughter had my Barbie and added some of her own. And now my granddaughters have my old Barbie and their moms and some new ones. That said, my granddaughters are more interested in Ariel and Elsa than Barbie. Do you think Barbie will eventually go away?
I love those stories. Yeah, the generational Barbies and the sewing, the clothes. My students had so many stories about moms and grandmothers who would sew clothes or pass down, their their Barbies. And I don't think Barbie is going to disappear. I think I think that Barbie as a concept, as an adult doll who is a child, a plaything for children, is very appealing because it allows girls to work out and to role play and to project into a future self, right? And that phenomenon is at the heart of why Barbie is, I think, interesting to children, right?
Mhm.
Barbie's interesting to adults for all kinds of other reasons. There's lots of Barbie collectors and, adult fans as well. But for children, the idea of projecting yourself into a version of your future self through doll play, I think is something that is part of human development and socialization. And so I don't think Barbie is going anywhere, but I do think that girls today have, different resources and different ideas, and they live in a different society, so they may not play with the doll in quite the same way. They may, think about their future selves in different ways. And in terms of the Elsa and the Frozen, I mean, that to me is just kind of sad because, then you're already, thinking about, I mean, this is just maybe my own preference for Barbie, but just, the idea of a film character, right, maybe closes down some of the imagination around
Mhm.
Barbie. I mean, Barbie is a generic in some ways, right? She's like femininity, but there's enough ambiguity that, you can project yourself into that in some ways.
Yeah, I know my daughter grew up during the time when Barbie movies were being made, animated ones of Barbie and Swan Lake, Barbie as the 12 Dancing Princesses, and all of these different like fairy tale things. And she wanted the Barbie for each of those films.
Yeah.
And it was, so that was Barbie as a specific character.
Mhm.
And I made sure that she had my Barbies, which were Barbies, I don't even know when they came up, but Barbie had short hair, and then she had wigs to put on if she wanted longer hair. And part of how we played with that was, um, I didn't have a Ken doll, but if Barbie was going to go on a date, we would just take the wig off of the one dresser in a suit that we had, and they would go out as
I
that was
love
our thing. And I'm like going, why not? That's who we have. So that was our male role model or whatever. And it was like, we had no problem with that being
Yeah. It's imaginative play, right?
right.
For sure. Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of sad when I was like going, I felt she was really restricted with these Barbies being
Mhm.
tied to a specific movie. Of course, Mattel is like, great, we're marketing and we're selling all of these different Barbies because of this.
Yeah.
Um, so one question, was G.I. Joe a backlash to Barbie or just competition, or was it just to give something
Oh,
for boys?
that is such a good question. So, we looked at G.I. Joe in my class, and G.I. Joe comes out around the same time as Barbie. And G.I. Joe is marketed to boys, and it's an action figure, right? It's like the earliest action figure. And what was really interesting when we started looking at G.I. Joe is how we could think about Ken as a very different model of masculinity. So we looked at the original Ken compared to the original G.I. Joe and their body sizes. And Ken is just like this slim, you know, small, petite, non-imposing figure compared to this bulky, action-oriented G.I. Joe. And I think Ken offered a different model of masculinity, right? That was not about physical domination or power in a way. Um, so but Ken was marketed to girls, right? And G.I. Joe was marketed to boys. So those toys were very segregated in terms of gender.
Mhm.
But the girls, Barbie, I think it's interesting that Mattel did not come up with a G.I. Joe version of masculinity for Ken. It was a very different model.
So, do you know if the cost of Barbie is accessible to similar classes throughout the years? It seemed really expensive when I was little in the 60s. And
Mhm. So you can go into a Target and get a Barbie still for like $11, a very generic basic Barbie. But Barbie exists in a world of accessories. And in a world of accessories, just like the consumer culture we live in, there's always more, right? Just like with the different versions of Barbie and those animated movies, right? So the impulse to be who you are and to express yourselves through the things that we buy, the consumer products that we buy, Mattel really tapped into that very early on. And they also, were very much on board with the idea of new and improved. So, new and improved versions of Barbie. You could never settle for just one Barbie, right? You always little tiny stylistic changes that you needed to have, and keeping up with all the different shoes and the houses and the dresses and the coats, and so, yes, it was expensive, right? It was Barbie in herself, just as one doll, may not be expensive, but to fully participate in Mattel's world, I think absolutely is. But then there are these stories about moms and grandmas who sewed the clothes and they resisted that. They did not go through Mattel and
mm.
or, using your other Barbie rather than the Ken. So I think that, there are ways, definitely there are ways that girls, were able to improvise and were able to, make their own kind of accessories too.
Okay, someone says, does the doll in its portrayal of an idealized and sexualized image contribute to the sexual ob objectification of women and the perception of women as objects for others' pleasure? I think kind of based on its creation from a German sex doll in a way. But does it still, I would say, maybe contribute to this? Um,
Well, that's a complicated question because there's never one reason for, how we think of ourselves, or
mm,
we think about the impact of Barbie. It's never one direct thing or, an immediate direct consequence. I think Barbie, for as long as Barbie's been around, Barbie has both symbolized and idealized femininity, or to be looked atness is what we call it. But I think at the same time, Barbie has always been a focal point of critique, right? And so that's what's interesting to me about Barbie is how, um, how you know, she can be both at the same time, right? And so that I think is it's just kind of a cipher in that way. So I wouldn't say that Barbie is unambiguous. I would say that, and again, going back to that chart, like what did the girls do with Barbie? Like I traced a kind of history of Barbie and how Barbie was designed in relationship to ideas about femininity and then challenges, and how Barbie is adapted in some ways and not other ways. Um, but there are also, lots of stories in the scholarship of people who did all kinds of interesting and controversial things with their Barbies. Um, and so yeah, I think it's complicated is what I would say.
Yeah, I'd say a challenge would be if on your computer, just type in Barbie doll and click on shopping and see what's out there right now. And you'll see it's not the same Barbie that you remember from your childhood when you scroll through and you're
Mhm.
looking. I know I did that earlier today, and it's just like, yeah, it's very different than um, the Barbie you might remember from when you're young. So even from when my daughter was young. So um, a good object lesson to see how much her depiction is changing and what their clothes that they're showing her in and things. And speaking of clothes, someone says, I noticed, Laurie, that you're wearing pink. Was
I
that a
am.
conscious choice?
I was almost going to wear my Barbie t-shirt, but then I thought, no, I'll just wear my pink dress. Yeah, you can see my slides are pink. You know, as a scholar of popular culture, it's a interesting fine line because I really enjoy a lot of popular culture, right? I really enjoy Barbie. I have a reproduction of the original Barbie. I've been teaching about Barbie for years and years and collecting these different Barbies. And I really enjoy Barbie, but at the same time, I am also a scholar and I'm also a critical scholar. So I'm also interested in the power dynamics around Barbie. So yes, I decided it would be fun to wear some pink and really lean into Barbie for today.
So, okay, this is it. People ask your questions. There's still time. Or share about your Barbie stories because it's true. They shaped our lives. I remember playing with my cousin's Barbie and she had the original dream house. That I remember that cardboard,
Mm.
um, the one without the kitchen. And I was like, wow, I do remember playing with that in my grandparents' basement. Okay, question came in. What is the typical age of the child who plays with Barbie?
Okay, they're young, right? They stop playing with Barbie well before they reach 13. So my students told me this. Like, we're talking about girls like 8, 9, 10. And I feel like children get older sooner. And so that's what they were telling me is when they were at their peak Barbie play. But then Mattel has a whole universe of, like you talked about the movies, and then they found those. So they're still attached to Barbie. And now Barbie does vlogs, Barbie's on TikTok. Barbie is a social media presence. I didn't even go into that, but that's another way Mattel is kind of making Barbie, part of the times as Barbie has gone virtual through these social media platforms. But in terms of actual doll play, I'd say it's between like 8, 9, 10, or earlier, younger.
Okay. I do have someone, Linda says, my mother only let my little nephews play with the Skipper dolls because their breasts weren't developed yet. So,
Oh no, that's so great. Right. Yeah, those breasts. I mean, they were so exaggerated. Yeah. Barbie never had nipples and neither Barbie or Ken had genitalia. So that was so interesting. And there's a lot of there was a lot of discussion around that with the market researchers and the company and how they could, be how Barbie could be sexual but actually not in some ways, like not actually look like a real woman. Yeah, interesting.
yeah, and yeah, when we talk about it, I think of all of the things in the movies. I'm going to talk about the selling of stuff, how like the Barbie cars and the Barbie. I just think of, I remember I had Barbie blow up furniture and things like that. And when it comes down to it, we just always have to remember it's a company who's trying to make money. But yeah, it was definitely, that's why they also have to think about how they portray her. And
Yeah. I mean, it really if you think about it, a movie, and it was a great movie, and I loved it, but based on a product, and now Mattel has plans to, is thinking about other movies based on its toys. I mean, in a way, that's a slippery slope, right? When,
Mhm.
when our culture becomes so intertwined with selling and with marketing,
Yeah.
right?
So, yeah, oh, let's see. Do you have any concerns about your research and teaching in the current Trump anti-DEI era?
Oh, that's a whole nother talk. Yeah,
But
that's a whole nother talk. Uh,
so,
yeah, it's tough. Yeah.
yes, I keep thinking of the question about women replacing men. I was just like going, I just feel that the women in the movie it was all women in charge of everything, and then it was the extreme of all men in charge of everything. And I feel that when she decided to become real, it was to learn how to exist with each other,
Yeah,
kind
that
of
makes
thing.
sense. Yeah, that
So,
absolutely makes sense.
so I sure wish my mom, Margie says, was around to discuss her thoughts as a World War II wife in giving me a Barbie doll.
Love it. Yeah, love it. I mean, I would just think, if you think about your mothers and what that doll meant to be able to give that doll, and what a difference that was from, the baby dolls and what that opened up. I think that kind of generational story too is really, really interesting.
Mhm. Yes, the fact that my grandmother hung on to, my cousin's Barbie doll to make sure that we got to play with it. Because my cousin was well older than me, about almost 18 years. Um, so, okay, how exactly does Mattel follow popular culture? Does it run focus groups? Does it mine social media? And
All of the above. And Mattel, the documentaries that I referenced, Black Barbie and Tiny Shoulders, are really inside looks at what goes on at Mattel. And there are some really creative designers and marketers. And yes, they do all of the research, and they are, have their internal like marketing departments. And so, yeah, they're very, very interested in trend forecasting, and thinking about how and why Barbie needs to adapt to, say, a trend in body positivity, right? So they are on it, right? Nothing is left to chance. This is not a one-woman shop anymore with Ruth Handel. This is a, multi-million dollar global company. So yeah, it's all there are whole like micro industries devoted to mining social media and figuring out, how to market toys to kids, but also make them attractive maybe to teenagers. And yeah, it's very much a business.
okay, well, we are almost at the end of our time, and I'm just wondering if you have any last thoughts you want to share or challenge us to look at something for more on Barbie.
Uh, don't get rid of your Barbie stuff, especially like, Barbie dream houses. Like, first of all, that is collector material at this point,
Mhm.
right? Just
Yeah.
hold on to it for, future generations. And I will just leave you with, again, this idea that popular culture can be multiple things at once, right? We can love it and enjoy it, we can learn from it, and we can also critique it, right? It's a way we have conversations with each other, right? So Barbie can be a way of having a conversation about gender. I would say try it. Try it with your family members, or try it with your, the young people in your life. And, and I know when I talk to 18-year-olds about Barbie, I cannot tell you how much I learned about their worlds, and it's fascinating.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us and for sharing your memories of Barbie, for asking great questions. And just want to remind you, this will eventually be up on the library's website. I'll make sure that everyone has that address, web address, probably next week. I'm hoping it'll be up by then, and we'll do that. So join us next week when we'll be talking about the war at home, the looking at here in the Twin Cities during World War I, that era, with local author Greg Gaunt. And everyone, have a great day, and thank you, Laurie, for sharing your insights.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Mhm.